Greetings, brothers and sisters. It's Pastor John, and I just want to welcome you to the last of the Prequel episodes on our study on the Sermon on the Mount. It was my hope with all of these that we would be better grounded and able to hear the message of Jesus kind of fresh and anew based on our understanding of the culture and the times that he was in when he gave this message to his disciples and to his followers. It will help us, I think, totally understand not only just the complexity of the message on the one hand, but the simplicity of the message, which appears to be complex, on the other. This today, I'm going to talk about what the order was, the social order was at the time that Jesus delivered this message, and compare and contrast it to our order now. So I've entitled this Jesus' New World Order because what he did at that point in time was to upset the order of things as they had been established in the time of the Roman emperors and in the time of the Pharisees and the scribes at that point. They had done things certain ways and had believed certain things and were not truly following the way and the will of God. So with this proclamation in the Sermon on the Mount and the rest of his life and teachings and his glorious resurrection following that abhorrent crucifixion, Jesus was trying to lead us in a new path. Now, I'm told by others that there are three kinds of cultures today, each with their own specific bottom line. We have political cultures based on the manipulation of power. We have economic cultures based on the manipulation of money. And we have religious cultures, cultures based on the manipulation of some sort of a theory about God. We did have and continue to have to a lesser degree a purely kinship-based culture, but these, quite frankly, are disappearing in our current world. These are the directions that human cultures take whenever they are left to their own devices. All three are based on some sort of violence, although it is usually denied by most participants and hidden from the superficial observer. Evil gains its power from concealment, it seems. It is precisely this disguise and death that God in Jesus came to destroy. Jesus announced, equipped, and inaugurated for history a new social order that is an actual alternative to each of the above, and an alternative that is inevitable not by reason of scientific determinism, but by the promise and grace of God. He called it the kingdom, or the reign of God. It is the subject of his inaugural address that we are discussing in the majority of his parables, and clearly the guiding image of his entire ministry. It was also the reason that he was killed, it being better for one man to die for the people than for anyone to question the bottom line that was holding the whole system together. If we can accept that Jesus was killed for the same reasons that people have been killed in all of human history, not because he walked around saying, "I'm God," we will have turned an important corner on our Jesus quest to walk in the footsteps of our rabbi. He was rejected, as we will see, much more so because of his worldview than because of his God view. Yet we know that they are intrinsically connected. This now and not yet reign of God is the foundation for our personal hope and our cosmic optimism, but is also the source of our deepest alienation from the world as it is. It will leave us as strangers and nomads on this earth. Our task is to learn how to live in both worlds until they become one world, or at least in us. The center point of Jesus' teachings is not an idea or theory about anything which differentiates it from the three kinds of cultures I previously mentioned, but is in fact a person, a thoroughly reliable and even lovable person that he calls his Father. This New World Order is based on the encounter with God, who is experienced personally. Jesus seems to be saying that God is not a philosophical system, a theory to be proven, or an energy to be discussed or controlled, although we have often tried to reduce God to that. Jesus believes that God is a person to be imitated, enjoyed, and loved. We seem to know God only by relating to God, almost as if God refuses to be known apart from love. It is all about relationship, though. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher and mystic, put it this way: all real living is meeting. All real living is meeting. That simple and totally available experience makes all the difference in the world for us. Jesus' new alternative is not another religious culture, however, and this is pivotal to understanding the unique character of his new world order. As opposed to a religious culture which is always using God for cultural purposes of control and manipulation through religious imagery, the reign of God disallows both possibilities. This is the difference between true transcendence and its disguises, between the true sacred and what we might call the false sacred. The false sacred can be spotted because it is always self-serving and other-destroying. This old sacrificial system does not continue, for it uses and it misuses God to sacralize the creation of victims. It might be old, but as we know, we continue this universal pattern even up until today, and in ever more sophisticated ways. The evil one, as we see it, must always be killed so that I can be worthy, I can be loved, I can be moral. Another group, nationality, class, religion, has to be named in the wrong so that I can feel right. There seems to be a need for the insecure and false self to have an enemy to scapegoat so that it can feel superior and saved. False gods, by definition, must be appeased. The true God needs nothing. The true God invites us into an unthinkable communion because of our undeserved gift of grace. While a religious culture can actually work to a degree and for a time, as it gives individuals and groups enough sense of cohesion and solidarity to create a partial community, it does lead us to scapegoat persons and groups we actually feel are outside of whose we belong to. It was the great American camaraderie for 20 years following World War II, right? We recognized an evil, and it was the Germans or the Japanese or the communists. They were bad losers, we were good victors. It was true on the political level, but not necessarily true on all the level that Jesus says is final and definitive. It is no surprise that many people see Christians in this light as opposed to Christians being a part of the reign of God. The true sacred, which is synonymous with the reign of God, is of an entirely different order and significance. On the level of experience, the true sacred always reveals that God is one and for all, for all. God is sovereign above any group ownership or personal manipulation. God is available as a free gift and not through the sacrificing of another, because God needs no victims and creates no victims. Jesus personifies this type of God and speaks defiantly in defense of such a God. Nowhere is he more succinct than when he quotes the prophet Hosea and says, "Go and learn the meaning of these words. Mercy is what pleases me, not sacrifice." No, this new world order that I'm talking about is so foundationally different, so transformative of perspective, that your education or intellectual ascent is truly inadequate for even preliminary understanding of it. It demands what becomes Jesus' next favorite theme, conversion, a complete turnaround of worldviews. His teaching is summarized in one line: the time is fulfilled, and the reign of God is close at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. And I love Mark when he says this. Conversion is not a learning as much as an unleashing. Conversion is an unleashing that comes like the dove descending once the old world order is unmasked and the great lover is revealed. Nowhere do we had to use phrases like falling from a horse, scales falling from our eyes, and the crowing of the rooster that are used throughout the New Testament. We will not, brothers and sisters, ever turn away from what seems like the only game in town, be it political or economic or religious, unless we have glimpsed an even far more attractive alternative. Jesus, for us, is a living parable, an audiovisual icon of a more attractive alternative to this world. We cannot even imagine it, much less imitate it, unless we see one human being doing it first. And for us, that was Jesus. Jesus has forever changed human imagination, and we are both now burdened and gladdened by this new possibility. There is good news. The good news, the counter of the deadening bad news that we all see blaring all around us. But we first have to be turned away from a conventional way of seeing, and that's what I hope this study will do for us. The most unsettling aspect of his alternative wisdom, and perhaps the most consistent, is that the outcast is at and in the Head Start position, precisely because he or she has been excluded from the false sacred system, the only game in town. Jesus thus begins with the most incredible statement in this sermon: the poor are the blessed ones. Life has already freed them from the lie that the rest of us cannot see. They are potentially turned around and given a symbolic advantage in hearing the truth. I tell you, tax collectors and prostitutes are making their way into the reign of God before you. If the system is a mess, those outside of it are at a significant advantage. Empathy for the victim, therefore, becomes the most subversive element in Jesus' teaching, although he was only building on his Jewish traditions and sympathies as he proclaimed his words. This teaching was so hard to comprehend that he had to finally image it in the manner of his passion and death so that we could get the message. As we see the gospel, Mark's in particular, the disciples cannot get it. Most of the church is still in the early stages of the comprehension to this day of his teachings. Why would the first be last? One of the most common one-liners. Unless there's something essentially mistaken about the system in which we are all trying to be first, especially if we have tried really, really hard. Against all odds, the one rejected by the norms of religion and culture, church and state, Jerusalem and Rome, the one crucified outside the walls, became the Lord of history. His life and death have turned human wisdom and judgment upside down. Once the victim becomes Lord, we will have a healthy mistrust of all attempts that domination, exclusion, and victimization of others present. If we were that wrong about what is good and what is evil, we best be pretty suspicious about the claims of all righteous judgments. They might just be wrong again. Self-criticism is an outstanding characteristic of the Jewish tradition. They are a people who incorporate into their sacred scriptures prophetic denunciation of themselves. Think of Isaiah. Think of Jeremiah as you hear these words. This unusual capacity for critical thinking becomes a hallmark of Jesus' own relationship with his tradition, and one could say it becomes a unique characteristic of groups influenced by his gospel, the good news. We call it the prophetic tradition. Without it, all groups and religions become idolatrous unto themselves. We are encouraged to welcome strangers, for by doing so, many people have entertained angels unaware. As Jesus put it in his only description of the final judgment, insofar as you did this to one of the least of these, you did it to me. I wonder what else could save us from our fear and accusation of one another except one whose judgments are both upside down and true, and whose mercy is everlasting. Fortunately, they are one and the same, a God who has both sanctuary and stumbling stone. Become, for this new world order, a yardstick, if you will. Unless we are confronted by true otherness, we will spend our lives rattling around inside our own world of preferences without any criteria to evaluate or critique them. There is no North Star to guide our little ship washed in a sea of time and chaos. True transcendence, the reign of God for us, becomes the measure by which all cultures and all human actions are to be judged. You yourself will sit on 12 thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. This absence is the weakness and continuing chaos of modern multiculturalism. Whose values prevail? By what criteria is this culture superior and that culture inferior? Are the measuring lines economic, political, aesthetic, or familial? Although the world has suffered much from these various forms of Christian colonialism, the world has nothing to fear from either the message or the message of the true Jesus, where we are all winners in the reign of God. Jesus is that right relationship, the ultimate and daily criterion for us all. If a social order allows and encourages and even mandates good connectedness between people and creation, people and events, people and people, people and God, then we have a truly sacred culture, the reign of God. The world as it would be if God were directly in charge would be a world of right relationship. It would not be a world without pain or mystery, but simply a world where we would be in good contact with all things, where we would be connected and in communion. Conversely, the work of the evil one is always to separate, divide, and draw apart. Jesus teaches that right relationship is all about union and communion, it seems, which means that it is about forgiveness and letting go, service, and lives of patience and simplicity. In the Sermon on the Mount teachings, the reign of God is the end of rivalry and of greed and of violence, which has all been destroyed. Jesus is the human dilemma answered. Crucial to Jesus' New World Order are some very special understandings of freedom that we have to clarify, I think, at this point now. Without God's definition of freedom, we will continue to use the gospel as if it were a product that can be bought, sold, imposed, or attained. The gospel is not a competing ideology that is threatened by anything outside its pale. It's not one of a so-called 10,000 things, but rather the gospel is that by which we compare and evaluate the 10,000 things. It is the weight of the world that ruminates the whole household. It is the yeast and not the whole loaf. It is the salt that gives flavor and nutrition to the much larger meal. We must accept that Jesus has given us an illuminating lens which we see and measure now all things. We can no longer treat Christianity as a threat nor allow it to be a threat to human or cultural freedom. It is, in fact, a true freedom's greatest ally and will hopefully become clearer. The gospel is a process much more than it ever was thought to be a product, a style more than a structure, a person more than a production. It is a way of being in the world that will always feel like compassion and mercy and spaciousness, at least to honest and healthy people. The gospel threatens nothing. The Spirit blows where it will. How different and healing Western history could have been if we had received such gospel freedom and modeled it for others from the time that Jesus walked amongst us. Jesus did not come to impose Christendom like an imperial system. The gospel just flourishes in the realm of true freedom. I do not think that Jesus ever expected the whole world would become formally Christian, but exposed to it. But I do believe that his truth about right relationship, his proclamation of the power of powerlessness, will be the message that is going to save the world from self-destruction and from eternal truth. I believe that Jesus is greatly called the Savior of the world and is able to do it through a minority position, because that's how Jesus enters the imperial city. He enters it not on a stallion, but rather on a donkey. He is the turning point of history, and we need to see it that way. The gospel will always insist that means and ends must be in complete agreement, or the final end is always polluted. There is no way peace, no way to peace. Peace is the way. There is no path toward love except in practicing love. More will always produce more violence. Love can do that. It can never bring about but violence can never bring about true peace. Much of the contents of the Sermon on the Mount have to do with this agreement between means and ends. It is probably one of the most ignored aspects of Jesus' teaching, and I think it might just be an attraction of many former Christians to things like Buddhism and nonviolent teaching. They had to leave home to find out what was hidden in their very own histories. Furthermore, Jesus has a different understanding of personal freedom too. Freedom is not the capacity to be what we are not, but the capacity to be fully who we already are, to develop our inherent selves as much as God allows. The perfect and full freedom of a fig tree is to become a perfect and full fig tree. Thus, Jesus curses the one that does not. Contrary to our Western understanding since the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, it is not freedom for a fig tree to try and bear oranges and apples, or to try to be a horse or a wastebasket. Surely there is a certain freedom from constraint here, but this is not very helpful kind of freedom. It only frustrates and finally destroys. It obstructs the tree's own fruitfulness and makes its own success impossible. It cannot work. Unfortunately, many of us are like the sick or dead fig trees, but with happy faces painted on our anemic apples, shouting, "But I am free!" Our addictive society has to do what it wants to do. The freedom offered by all great spiritual traditions is quite different than that. Spiritual and true freedom is wanting to do what we have to do to become who we are. For some reason, humans rebel at what feels like external mandates. When we listen for a while, we can often realize that it is also our deepest inner desire. The truth that all things desire to be themselves now has a different ring to it if you look at it. No longer is it a scary search for private authenticity, but rather a patient acceptance of the truth that is in us. The difference there is the difference between wisdom and mere reaction, and it takes most of us a long time to get to that point. We will not appreciate Jesus' loyalty to the law and the prophets as he claims in Matthew if we do not accept his deeper understanding of this concept of freedom. As freedom of movement and liberty to choose between options. That surely is a good and important freedom. There is no indication that the great spiritual teachers, Jesus included, see it as essential, however. They seem to recognize that the world of preferences and possibilities does not of itself lead to wisdom, truth, or even to a depth of experience. In fact, in the spiritual life, the rule seems to be that less is more. There is almost no correlation between the number of options and the amount of truth or goodness that one attains. I'm afraid that the cry of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, has formed us so much more than what many call the Jesus Revolution. His cry might have been something more like identity, justice, and community. Think about the differences of those two phrases and calls to action, if you will, for a moment. All great religions advise a certain degree of necessary opposition, a refining of the question, a deep choosing of our true position that comes only through time and trial. The promise of the reign of God does not offer us pie in the sky, but just enough finger food to keep us nibbling and open for more. But how? The promise of the reign of God does not take away the opposition, but rather, in fact, ensures it, the not yet. That is the razor's edge of full faith existence that we must try to stay on the edge of the knife. There is no such thing as victory of the Spirit if it is attained by coercion, by mandate, or by social pressure. Paul said it in great urgency and anger to his community and population when he said, "Are you foolish enough to resort to the law for what you began in the Spirit? Has grace been wasted on you? If this is so, it has most certainly been wasted." Wow, how did that become lost in our tradition? A political culture like the Roman Federation will always use power and totalitarianism ways to achieve its purposes. We can never expect Caesar to do Christ's work. We can never proclaim the Exodus from Pharaoh's palace. If we try, as we certainly have attempted to do, it will always be on the ruler's terms. You would think we would have learned that by now. The reign of God never sells humanity short. In Paul's later description, he forbids us to trivialize God's plan. A privilege of yours must not be allowed to give rise to harmful talk, for it is not eating and drinking that make the reign of God, but the saving justice, the peace and joy that is brought by the Holy Spirit. There's a certain challenge that it's proper to and needed by human nature. We seem to need some obstacles that are worthy of our energy and our passion. The soul is not slovenly and flourishes only in the presence of certain opposition. As Simone Weil put it, truth and affliction are necessary allies. When Jesus offers the great repayment for loss of house, brothers, sisters, father, children, and land, he adds only one extra reward to the promise of 100-fold return, and that is persecution. It doesn't sound like a reward. How unless communion and love are the final goals? If communion and love are the final goals, we have to be able to understand that persecution will be here. There is a telling phrase that is used in the Acts of the Apostles. to describe this new sect that is upsetting the old world order in Thessalonica. The Christians of that town were dragged before the city council and called the people who have been turning the world upside down. They have broken Caesar's edicts. People are not called before the city council for minor inner beliefs or attitudes unless they are also upsetting the social order. As we go into the specific teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, as we look at all of his healing and miracles, we find that there is a rearranging of the social relationships and therefore of the social order. And you know what? That's a good thing. What was the social order of the old day that we're talking about? And I want to lead into this for a while now. Most societies create social classes, consciously or unconsciously. Like it or not, it gives great comfort to the psyche to at least know where we stand. Societies with obvious social classes tend to create less widespread discontent. To understand the social order Jesus was challenging, we must understand the class system that agrarian society was living in at the time of his life. At that time, the top of the society was a ruler. The ruler was one person in a class all by themselves, usually a king or a queen or a Caesar in Roman times or an emperor. In most agrarian societies, the ruler controlled or had complete access to at least 25% and sometimes up to 50% of the gross national product. Everything went to aggrandize that person. We today might think, wasn't that evil? But you have to understand that underneath the enormous inequity, there were actually some positive effects. Without condoning, we can note that having a ruling class gave people much more social security in the real meaning of that term than people have now. People knew where they stood and what their role was. And that kind of a rigid social class, no one could compare themselves to the ruler. He or she was the ruler and was supposed to have the lion's share of the gross national product. People outside of that ruling class accept what they have. Now, the second class in an agrarian society, which made up about 1% of the population, was the governing class. The bureaucrats, the nobles and officials who surrounded the ruler. They received, as a group, at least an additional 25% of the gross national product. This 1% and the ruler owned half, if not 75% of all the goods and services in that kind of society. Then there was the retainer class, those who maintained the system. They are the lower bureaucrats, the military, the scribes, the teachers in Jesus' society. They comprised about 5% of the population. Retainers served the political elite. They are the secretaries and the soldiers. They want to keep their jobs, so they fight for the ruler and the 1% who had the money. Retainers have some degree of education and know-how. This class in Jesus' society merits a closer look as we set the stage for the other classes and ultimately for the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm just struck by the fact that as I'm presenting this to you in this class at this point in time, if you're watching the clouds behind us, it's signifying the clouds of a storm coming, a time for the new world order to come into. The scribes were in this class. You might have noticed that in so many of the miracle stories and exorcisms, the scribes get upset with Jesus. Why do you think that was? Because he's taking away their job security and their money. To understand the import of any Jesus miracle, we need to read not only who he's talking to at the beginning of that miracle, but who is upset at the end. Normally, the people who are upset at the end have just seen their jobs made unnecessary. Scribes, the equivalent of lawyers today, were those who, since the days of the book of Leviticus and the book of Numbers, had manufactured a very complex system of law that created a demand for their expertise. Scribes would help people wade through the system, and of course, to wade through with them, you had to pay them something. In Israel, at the time of Jesus, church and state were truly one. And of course, to wade through everything, you had to pay everybody something. The laws were largely tied up with religion. For example, if there were very clear rules on how a person with leprosy was to be clean and what that person would do. There were clear rules about how a woman was to be treated. So when Jesus goes around the countryside touching people and saying, "Be made clean," that is an incredibly subversive action for this class. You can't do this, a scribe might have said. You just ignored the whole legal system. Or that could be read, you've just taken away our benefits, our livelihood, our money. Understanding this, it becomes much more obvious why most of the Jewish leadership cooperated in having Jesus killed. Jesus was making God way too accessible. He ignored the debt codes, the purity codes, and the honor and shame system that held the whole thing together. The governing class, retainers, and rulers were, of course, almost entirely against Jesus, with some precious and beautiful examples. Matthew was one of them, and yet he was a man of the system. The merchant class comes next. That class was very small in an agrarian society. In Jesus' lifetime, it comprised less than 5% of the total population. It wasn't until way later, sometime in the 13th century, that the merchant class began to take over. But we're going to save that for another course. The last of the first 5 classes that comprised the establishment was the priestly class. They were landowners then, just as they have been in one way or another throughout history, and this continued up through the time of the Reformation, where sheriffs worked for the monks. Besides the 5 ruling classes in an agrarian society, there were many lower classes. Now, these folks comprised at least 80% of the population in the society. Those who farmed the land were the peasant class. Very often they were tenant farmers. Someone else owned the land. That's why so many of the parables of Jesus is about landlords and tenants. The folks he taught could lose their livelihood in just a moment. They were at the whim of the ruling class and the landlords. Nearly 2/3 of what they produced was spent on rent, taxes, and tolls, all for the upper classes. You can imagine surviving as a peasant in a year of drought, right? After you've given away nearly 2/3 to the ruling class and to those whom you are subservient to, you still need to save enough of your grain for seed for the next year so that you can plant again. And you must save enough to feed your cattle or other livestock. Whatever teeny weeny little bit is left over is all you and your children have to live on for the upcoming year. That's how most poor people have lived since the beginning of time. In 2/3 of the world today, it's still much that same way. Now, Jesus comes from this lower group. He was a Galilean, a peasant. Some current studies even question whether Jesus, the man, was literate as we find that word to mean today. Jesus was a poor, simple man who knew how peasants struggled. We must understand that in order to understand his message more fully. Most of the people he taught were in the same situation that he was in. Jesus and his audience truly understood each other. Let that sink into your heart. We often elevate Jesus above all society around him, but his viewpoint, his true viewpoint, was that he was from the lower class. Maybe that is why he was so very comfortable with those from the lower class. described in our scriptures often as sinners. Now, within the peasant class, there were subclasses. Our seventh class were the artisans, comprising about 5% of the population. They were skilled workers, such as carpenters, who were recruited from the ranks of dispossessed peasants. They always had to depend upon a person for their livelihood. Artisans were gifted, yet they remained poor. Oh, by the way, Jesus was a carpenter. The eighth class of society was comprised of the people who were deemed unclean by reason of origin or occupation. For example, in Jewish society, people who took care of pigs were considered unclean. The unclean still exists in all societies today, although the label is a little bit more subtle and often unadmitted. And here you can think of people of color, maybe poor people, old people, people with disabilities, and for us today, maybe even non-Christians and foreigners. All these are our modern version of unclean groups in Western society. Jesus has a great deal of contact with this group as we listen to all of the gospel stories. But the unclean were not so low as to be totally expendable. The ninth class might have been as much as 5 or 10% of all the peasants. These expendable ones had to live by their wits, call them criminals, or if they lived on the purity of others, call them beggars. They were unemployed or unemployable. Lepers were often in this class, although sometimes they'd be a notch higher in the unclean class. The word that Matthew uses for poor in spirit, for example, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, is spelled P-T-O-C-H-O-Y, Pachoi. It refers to not just peasants, but to these very bottom classes, the destitute. Jesus is saying that you may be at the very bottom of the heap, but I want you to know, you'll get freedom there, and I'm going to help you find it. He's talking to the least of the brothers and sisters, as we will see, the lowest of the peasant class. Many of Jesus' comments about the poor are these last two classes, the unclean and the expendable people. The farmer still has his land that he's working, rented or owned. He was dirt poor, but at least he had something to fall back on. Basically, they had a similar structure to what we have today if you look at it. The expendable people who are unemployed or unemployable. It's this class that is growing so quickly in our society, the unexpendable or the unacceptable people. They are taken and looked at differently, and we have said, we will undereducate you, undertrain you, and undervalue you. We will throw you into prisons. We even hypothetically hope that you will kill one another. We hope the drugs and guns will allow you to kill one another because we can't fit you into our Western definition of success, our definition of reality. Yet it was the people truly at the bottom of society then and now for whom Jesus most consistently showed concern. They seem to be the measure of how well we understand the new world order. Brothers and sisters, someone does not go around eating with the underclass, touching the untouchable, sending lepers back to polite society as a testimony, and collaborating with upstarts down at the river without turning traditional societies upside down. City councils are not places that we go to for profound wisdom. Their job is to hold societies together where they always had held together, at the level of conventional wisdom called the way we always do it. You've heard those words used before, the way we always do it. It was here and it happened in Thessalonica. One of the major weaknesses of Christians now is our understanding of Jesus is that we really do not understand what it was that made Jesus worth killing. It was not because he walked around saying, I am God. There are four principal areas of conventional wisdom, among others, that Jesus seems to ignore, to oppose, or even subvert. And that is family, possessions, status, and the very nature of sacrificial religion. These were enough to get him killed. But I hope, and my prayer, is that as we continue our studies in person from this point forward, looking at each and every verse of the Sermon on the Mount, that all of you will look for, be searching for this alternative wisdom of Jesus as presented in his very first sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And brothers and sisters, you will now have several days or weeks before we actually begin our in-person study. I hope that the words that you've heard in these 5 prequel episodes will lead you to just wanting to know more and more about Jesus and his way, that we will be prepared as disciples to put on our sandals and follow in the dust of our Rabbi, Jesus the Christ. And I pray that God will hold each of you in the palm of his hand until we meet again. Amen.